Okay, good evening and welcome. My name is Cristian Măcelaru. I'm joined by your wonderful clarinettist from within the orchestra, Sergio López, who is with us. It's interesting that Benny Goodman, who was, technically he was a jazz clarinettist, really, and he paid a lot of money for commissions to classical composers to write music for the clarinet. From Bartók, as you said, to Milhaud, to Copeland. And this has an interesting story to it because when he commissioned Copeland, I think this was in 1948, at the time he paid $2,000 for the commission, which is a lot of money, and at the time was a lot of money. And it took Copeland a little bit of time to write it, right? It took him, the first movement he wrote immediately, and then
2 years to make one first version, which then Benny Goodman revised with Copeland as well. And then they made a few changes to make it a bit more accessible to the playing. Basically, it was too difficult. But yeah, that's how long it took. 2-3 years, more or less.
Although I did notice that there are certain things that you do that Copeland wrote originally that then Benny Goodman changed, but you decided to do the original Copeland, which is much harder, right?
Yeah, I decided to give that a go for myself more than any other thing, like a challenge, or because otherwise I don't know when I'm gonna try. And we always play the normal version, and I think it's good to listen bits of the original one as well, because nobody knows them, and I certainly didn't until the other day.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is it? From a clarinet player's perspective, so you have the Mozart, which is glorious as a piece, and you have the Webern, as Carl Maria von Webern. How does the Copeland compare to these other pieces in terms of technical difficulty? I'm just curious.
Well, it's, the register, it's more broad, it goes lower and much, much higher in terms of that. And then it's more technically demanding. They all are really difficult, but they have their own kind of difficulty, like in Mozart is the good taste, the beautiful sound, all of that, and Weber same. But here, well, there's lots of acrobatics for the clarinet. And then there's, and this is something that is quite interesting to explore, because obviously Benny Goodman was a really fantastic jazz player. So there's elements of jazz, and Copeland certainly had that in mind when he composed this piece. But I don't think only that. I think it's just music, it's music making, and you have to play it as well. For sure, the first part of it, I think, especially with the discipline of a more classical, traditional approach, like just music making, beautiful phrasing. You can do vibrato, be expressive, and then the jazz comes in the cadence and a bit later.
Yeah, well, to me, it's also fascinating that the first movement in some ways belongs to a completely different period of Copeland's writing. And I think the first movement is really in the heart of what we think of today as Copeland's main musical language. When we think of Appalachian Spring, or we think of pieces like this that Copeland wrote, this is exactly what the first movement is. It's very tender and very gentle, very open harmonies. He makes use of the pentatonic scale very, very well, so that it feels like there's not a lot of dissonance. Everything is very smooth. And then comes the cadenza, which I'm sure the cadenza he wrote after he wrote the second movement, because the cadenza is supposed to link the two movements together, but it almost completely ignores the first movement, and it only references the second movement, which he wrote after, as you said, after a while. And then the second movement, it's a completely different musical style. In fact, it's a musical style that we don't find so often in Copeland's music. He speaks of American folklore, and he speaks of that kind of music, but not quite as successfully in the jazz idiom. Which I think he does in this piece very, very well. One last question from me, and then maybe we'll take some questions from the audience. Is it fun to play it, or is it scary?
Oh my God, it's both, but it's mostly fun. You know, it's like 99% fun, 1% a little bit scary. You know?
Well,
Yeah,
having been on the podium, I can tell that you're having a really good time in rehearsals, and you will see why, because it's both a spectacular piece.
Oh, it's very flashy, very.
Yeah, it
very
features
effective.
the instrument so beautifully. And I have to say one thing, you know, the clarinet part is what it is. The orchestra part, this is perhaps one of the most challenging orchestra parts that has ever been written.
Yeah.
So,
That's true.
as the musicians, you know, I told them, I said, you know, we got to put on our seatbelts
Yeah.
for this one, because it's Copeland was sort of merciless about what he
Oh, yeah.
demanded of the strings.
Yeah,
and this,
we're all a bit with the sweat there, you know, for this concerto.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The question is there any difference in the orchestral writing of the versions? Most of it has to. Do you want to answer it, or I can answer?
Well, there's a few differences as well from the original. When they met to revise and then they made these changes for the clarinet part, as well, there were some which we experienced yesterday in rehearsal. This goes back to what you say about that the cadenza was written probably after that, because the link between the first part and the cadenza didn't really work, or they didn't think it really worked. There's this viola passage slash harp slash, you know, they didn't really know what to do there.
One thing that is fascinating is that because Copeland didn't quite endorse all the suggestions that Benny Goodman made, I mean, he accepted it, but didn't make them as official changes. So then the score has several passages that has ossia, optional passages. So you can choose which instrument is actually playing it. So one of the passages that he's referring to is Benny Goodman didn't want to play, so then Copeland rewrote it for the viola and for the harp to do it. But Sergio wanted to play it, so then we canceled the viola, and then he did this, but then we added the harp because it had to finish the phrase. So there's a little bit of improvisation, if I can call it, for this piece as it goes along, because all the parts are in the score, but you have to choose which one plays sometimes. The question is, the gentleman feels that Copeland's jazz music refers to an earlier part of his compositional life, when he wrote pieces like the Piano Concerto and Music for the Theater, which is wonderful representations of the jazz idiom. And he feels like the second movement of the Clarinet Concerto is a throwback to that period, but it's slightly more disciplined, or is it slightly more disciplined? What do you think?
I don't know the Piano Concerto at all. I should listen to it. I think, well, as far as I can comment, just on the concerto, it feels it's quite precisely written. What we will call the second movement, the second part of the piece. So, yeah, it's like he's writing with that in mind, you know, that sort of jazzy and very brave and youthful, energetic, but it's all quite. Yeah, all the information is there. You know, you don't really need to, I don't think, invent much. You know, you just need to make your own interpretation of it and just enjoy what he did, I think.
There is one, it is more disciplined, but there is one passage that always strikes me how much it is like Stravinsky's symphony in 3 movements. There is one passage that refers directly to that kind of musical style. And I think both in the harmonic language and in the rhythmical language of it. From a conducting point of view, this piece presents more challenges for the conductor and for the orchestra than either the piano concerto or music for the theater, which I find fascinating, not in the first movement, in the second movement, especially when you know, there's an entire passage that is written in 5/8 time, but I mean, the perception of it is in 5/8 time, but he actually writes it in 3/4. So you always have one too many eighth notes in every single measure. And it's just maddening you know,
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Because you know you have to avoid giving an accent on a strong beat in order to keep the 5/8 rhythm, but at the same time, the strong beat always falls on the wrong pulse, and it has to be against what feels natural about that. The question is, how often is the Copeland being performed? Well, first of all, you need to find a clarinettist that is able to do it. You need to find a conductor that is willing to tackle it. And you need to find an orchestra that is, you know, again, willing to put up with it. So it's I think it is so difficult a piece that that's why it's not performed as often. Plus, you know, unfortunately, the clarinet is not always featured as a solo instrument in front of the orchestra. You know, so by default, you would have violin, piano, or voice, the cello. And then when those options are exhausted, then people look at the clarinet or other instruments. So it's a real pity because you will see and as you said, you've heard it already, it's a phenomenal piece of music and fun for everyone.